In the realm of human achievement, there are tales that stand as shining examples of resilience and triumph. These stories, born from the depths of adversity, inspire us to overcome our own obstacles and find strength within ourselves. One such remarkable story is that of George Matheson from the Stories of Grit by Archer Wallace, a blind boy who defied all odds to become not just a poet, but also a preacher and an author. Join us as we delve into the extraordinary life of this courageous individual, who proved that greatness can be found even in the darkest of circumstances. Chapter 1: The Blind Boy Who Became Poet, Preacher and Author. George Matheson was born in Glasgow, Scotland, on March 27, 1842. When he was only 18 months old, his mother made the melancholy discovery that his eyesight was defective. He had inflammation at the back of the eyes. Several specialists were consulted, but little hope was held out to the boy's parents. The failure of his eyesight was gradual. For several years he could see fairly well. During the greater part of his school life he could read and write by using powerful eyeglasses and large type. He was permitted to sit near the window so that he might get the full benefit of the sunlight. In spite of the serious difficulties that faced him during those years, George Matheson took high standing in his class. He managed to learn French, German, Latin, and Greek, and in some subjects, he led his class. He was ever hoping that his eyesight would improve. It was the custom of his family to spend most of their summer holidays at one of the seaside resorts on the Firth of Clyde, and George took great delight in watching the steamboats as they plied up and down the river. It was there that he spent many anxious hours testing his eyesight. He would stand on the pier and watch the boats in the distance. He would try to make out how many funnels each had, and as they drew nearer, what their names were. At times he thought that his eyes were improving, but at last, he had to admit to himself that they were gradually getting worse. For the greater part of his life, he was largely dependent upon other people. His lessons at college were read to him, and, thanks to a marvelous memory, he learned with amazing thoroughness. He had a wonderfully cheerful disposition. To become blind when so young would have been sufficient to crush all brightness out of most lives, but not so with George Matheson. He rose above his terrible calamity and showed himself a real hero. When only 11 he was admitted to the Glasgow Academy. He took his place alongside other pupils, studied the same subjects, and sat for the same examinations. When it came to marking his exam papers, no favors whatever were granted to him, and yet his 4 years at the Academy were years of unbroken distinction. In his first year, he gained the prize for history and religious knowledge. In his second year, he gained prizes in Latin, history, geography, and English composition. In his third and fourth years, he won nearly all the special prizes and finished with a wonderfully high record. He matriculated for Glasgow University in 1857, when he was only 15. During his term there his eyesight became gradually worse, until by the time he was 18 he was practically blind. When this terrible handicap is taken into consideration, George Matheson's record at the university stands as a wonderful example of perseverance and pluck. In all his classes he stood high and especially shone in debates and oratorical contests. He received his BA degree in 1861, with honorable distinction in philosophy, and his MA degree 1 year later. In 1862 he entered Divinity Hall to study for the ministry. For 4 years he gave himself to the most careful preparation for that calling, and in 1866, after 9 years spent in Glasgow University, he was licensed to preach. In January 1867, George Matheson became the assistant minister at St. Bernard's Parish in Glasgow. He preached regularly to large congregations and prepared his sermons with much care. When he stood up to preach, people forgot all about his blindness. He committed the whole service to memory, hymns, lessons, and sermons, and such was his splendid memory, that he never seemed at a loss for anything to say. After a year at St. Bernard's, he was appointed minister of Ellen Church, where he remained for several years and preached and ministered to a very large congregation. Ellen, because of its beautiful situation and bracing air, had become a favorite summer resort, and to these attractions was added George Matheson's fame as a preacher. People came from far and near to hear him, and none ever went away disappointed. What a picture it is to think of that blind man, standing there in his pulpit, instructing and comforting people who had perfect eyesight and seemed more favored than he. Yet in all his sermons and in his conversations, there was cheerfulness and gratitude to God. No one ever heard him murmur or complain, and when he stood up and offered prayer, or read the Psalms in his clear, ringing voice, everyone realized that his whole heart was in the service. He became known as Matheson of Annelen, and many people went there, summer after summer, in order to hear him preach. In 1886 George Matheson was called to St. Bernard's Church, Edinburgh. In May of that year, he began his work as minister to that congregation and remained for 13 years. It was a very large congregation. There were nearly 1,500 members, in addition to hundreds of others who were simply attendants. Dr. Matheson resolved that he would not only preach to his people but would visit them in their homes. His sister was deeply attached to him and accompanied him wherever he went. Before he had been 6 months at Edinburgh he had visited 600 families, besides calling upon the sick, the aged, the infirm, and the dying. In addition to all this he was preparing sermons of rare quality and working in close sympathy with all the associations of his church. The visits he made upon his people were occasions long to be remembered. He was so warm-hearted and full of sympathy, that every person he met realized that it was no formal visit. Dr. Matheson kept up this method of visitation throughout his whole ministry. His church grew until there were nearly 1,800 members, yet he made a determined effort to keep in close touch with them all, and, blind though he was, he succeeded much better than most men would have done who had perfect vision. Like Henry Fawcett, the blind Postmaster General of England, Dr. Matheson had a marvelous memory. No doubt the loss of eyesight does much to quicken the faculty of memory. Often after he had preached, the vestry would be besieged with people who were anxious to speak with him. Many of these people had known him before, and it was a source of amazement to them to have the blind preacher call them by name almost immediately after hearing them speak. Sometimes visitors from a distance, whom he had not seen for many years, would say, "You'll not remember me, Doctor." Perhaps a puzzled look would cross his face, then he would say, "Yes I do, you are Mackintosh." It would be Mackintosh right enough, and Mackintosh would be a very much surprised man. In addition to his preaching and visiting, George Matheson was the author of many fine books. In 1882 he published a book of meditations with the title, My Aspirations. The success of this book was instantaneous, and in a very short time the entire edition was sold out, and several other editions followed. Later he published many other volumes, among them being, Moments on the Mount, Voices of the Spirit, Searching in the Silence, Times of Refreshing, Leaves for Quiet Hours, and Rests by the River. His books proved helpful to thousands of people. From every part of the world, letters came from people whose lives had been greatly blessed by reading the works of the blind author. What was true of his preaching was also true of his writing. People felt, at once, the strong, cheerful, grateful heart of the author. Great numbers of people, around whose lives heavy clouds had gathered, had their hearts strengthened, and their faith in God renewed, as they read George Matheson's books. In 1882 he wrote his famous hymn, now known the world over, "O Love, that will not let me go." It would be impossible to tell just what this hymn has meant to thousands of people. The hymn is now found in most hymnals and has become a great favorite. George Matheson gives the following account of how he came to write it. The hymn was composed in the manse of Annelen on the evening of the 6th of June, 1882. I was at that time alone. It was the day of my sister's marriage, and the rest of the family was staying overnight in Glasgow. Something had happened to me, which was known only to myself, and which caused me the most severe mental suffering. The hymn was the fruit of that suffering. It was the quickest bit of work I ever did in my life. I had the impression of having it dictated to me by some inward voice rather than of working it out myself. I am quite sure that the whole work was completed in 5 minutes, and equally sure that it never received at my hands any retouching or correction. George Matheson lived to be 64 years of age and managed to fill every hour with useful and loving service. To read an account of one day's work in the life of this blind man is sufficient to make most people realize how hard he worked. He was methodical in his habits and careful to leave no duty undone. After breakfast each morning he attended to his correspondence, generally answering letters by return mail. Then he would have read to him the morning papers. He showed a keen interest in everything that was going on. From that, he would pass on to his studies in French and German. This would be followed by some study in science, philosophy, history, or theology. Then he would dictate to his secretary, something for the press or for his own use as a speaker. Added to such work, of course, there were his extensive labors as a pastor and preacher, and it can be truthfully said that he did not fail in anything. Whatever task he put his hand to, he did with all his might. George Matheson died at North Berwick, on August 28, 1906, and was buried at Glasgow a few days later. Tributes of sympathy came to his relatives from all over the world. By his strong preaching, and probably still more by his brave, cheerful spirit as set forth in his books, he had helped a very great number of people everywhere. In his noble hymn he had written, "I trace the rainbow through the rain." That is exactly what he did. Where so many others saw only difficulties, he saw possibilities. And so it came to pass that, though he lived in darkness for nearly half a century, he served God and his fellow men with a devotion which will never be forgotten. As we bid farewell to the incredible journey of George Matheson, we cannot help but be awestruck by his unwavering determination and unwavering spirit. From his humble beginnings as a young blind boy in Glasgow to his impactful ministry and prolific literary works, Matheson's legacy continues to illuminate the path of those facing adversity today. His life reminds us that limitations need not define us, and that with grit and tenacity, we can navigate through the darkest storms, guided by love, hope, and an unyielding belief in our own potential.